and I will hand it off to today's speaker, Peter Dumont.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning for those further west than those of us on the East Coast. Welcome to today's discussion. So today we're obviously discussing Hipaa de-identification. I think most of us are familiar with the de-identification requirements under Hipaa. A quick summary of what that means, and their various definitions of the de-identification are that it's a process that eliminates and reduces information, certain identifiers and values from protected health information, and thus creates de-identified data. This addresses the privacy risk for individuals, and as a result, the de-identified data can be used to support secondary use of the data for studies, research, development, and other activities. I think often if we do see de-identification in the news, it's in a negative light, and we'll cover points and tips and considerations to hopefully avoid any of us from being the subject of those negative de-identification news articles. So a quick orientation to the agenda. We'll cover and we'll provide an overview touching on the methods that are permitted for de-identification under Hipaa, and then we'll go deeper into some of the technical and privacy considerations for entities, and we'll close with some recent industry and other news articles and leave time for questions at the end. So Hipaa de-identification, the exact requirements are located in the Hipaa Privacy Rule 164514. It's important to remember that this is a legal standard. If you're not working with your legal counsel or an attorney when you're doing de-identification, I recommend you consider doing so. Even if you think your data is de-identified and you have no intention of ever re-identifying it, if it doesn't meet the legal standard, it might not be Hipaa de-identified data. It's also important for you to consider your role when you do de-identification. And in a role, we'll use the Hipaa terms if you're a business associate or a covered entity, and more so if you're a business associate, you should always make sure you have that permission to de-identify. It might not be something, as if you're a BA, you can always do. Another important point to remember is that de-identified data is not PHI, therefore it's not subject to the Hipaa privacy and security rules. However, and we'll look at this in more detail later on, there's often confidential or sensitive data that remains in the de-identified data, and those elements and what they are and how you handle those should be carefully considered. And of course, the European differences around privacy are recently in the news, and just to make sure that point is understood here, that Hipaa de-identified data is not an international standard. So the Europeans, of course, have a very different interpretation of what de-identified data is, or to use their term, anonymized data is under the Data Protection Directive, and it might not always be the case that Hipaa de-identified data is anonymized under the European standards. And then just a quick moment to touch on some areas of potential confusion. We often hear the terms tokenization and masking being used. Well, those are valuable tools that I think can be used to support de-identification. They might not always deliver de-identified data. So where you're using methods like that, I think it's important to scrutinize the output to make sure that that data is de-identified if that's the end goal. An example might be if you were to mask a certain number of elements in a social security number, the result might not be de-identified data. And so look closely at what the output of those masking and tokenization processes are. So there are two methods to de-identify data under HIPAA. The first method is the safe harbor method. It requires the removal of 18 specified identifiers. And while most of those are fairly obvious, like social security number, name, telephone number, there are a couple that are often tripping points. The first of those is the one that is designated as B in the HIPAA rule, and that is around geography. So state is permitted in the safe harbor de-identified data. ZIP3 is also permitted. However, you'll need to make sure that you're only disclosing those with populations greater than 20,000. And you should be pay careful attention to what you're using to determine those populations that require the 000 designation. If you're using ZIP3, is make sure that's accurate. Be careful not to use maybe the 2000 census data. I would recommend use something more current, like the 2010 census data, to determine what populations require the zeroing out if you're using ZIP3s. Dates, you of course are only allowed to use year as opposed to full dates, and that includes dates that relate to birth of an individual, and that's often an issue. So I would be caution you to use something that might be more detailed, like month, quarter, half year related to birth. Those could all run afoul of the safe harbor method. And then it's also important to remember that you need to collapse ages for individuals older than 89 years old, something that is can be overlooked. And then we'll get into this a little more later on in the presentation, but there are unique codes you need to be careful to consider, and the 2012 guidance from OCR went into this in I think reasonably well depth, how to handle those codes, how to retain the uniqueness but make sure they're not identifiable. And the second method, of course, is the expert method. This method is also commonly referred to as the statistical method. It is often more desired, the more preferred method for researchers. People use terms like certification. You'll see determination and certification interchanged in what's required. So people will say, do you have a certification that your data has been de-identified by an expert, or determination? It's important to remember that if you're using, if it requires using an expert, but when using an expert, that expert is in fact an expert. I think the HIPAA rule uses the term, uses the example of a biostatistician. Someone of that caliber is probably qualified, but you should also consider that they have a statistical and scientific background, understand the methods for transforming PHI so that it's no longer identifiable, and they have the ability to determine that the risk is small, of the resulting data has a very small risk of being re-identified. And then it's also critical that the process and the analysis be documented, because that is what will be used as evidence to show that an expert looked at the data and performed the analysis. So this is the expert method is I think by design more complex. Safe harbor, I think, was designed to be simple, quicker way to de-identify. The expert method is obviously more complex. You might want to consider engaging an outside privacy expert, privacy counsel, or outside statistician if you're using the expert method. So just wanted to touch on some factors influencing the use of de-identified data. And these are recent factors. One, in the term big data is often used. And that is driving the use of data for research, analytics, product development. That, of course, is the desire by businesses or entities to have more data for use is driving the use of de-identified data, or the desire to create de-identified data. And then kind of supporting this is the desire to manage risk. Of course, there's been countless breaches in the news recently, and where we're able to get to a minimum necessary or to reduce the amount of protected health information our businesses and vendors and customers have, we're able to manage that risk. And so certain analytical functions might be able to use de-identified data. Certain software activities might be able to use de-identified data as opposed to PHI, and those will help reduce risk across businesses. So I promised we'd touch on this. So managing unique codes. This is a tricky aspect. It's a common tripping point under de-identification. The values like SSN, I think, are obvious that those need to be removed, and that's often what's done. The other codes or keys that remain can be difficult to identify and difficult to reduce or remove from the data. A good kind of litmus test to consider is that if the ID or code or keys resides in a PHI database, it might fall into the unique code definition and might need to be handled appropriately. It might need to be de-identified. The OCR guidance goes into some detail here and recommends salting and hashing in that order. It's important to use a hash that is safe, and NIST does an excellent job of maintaining a list of these safe hashing algorithms. It's also important if you're going to use, if you're using a salt, which I highly recommend if you're going to hash data. We'll show a neat example why that's important. That salt is confidential and kept in a safe, secure manner. So in this example is, some of you may have seen this, but received publicity in the media outlet Gawker. And so the background quickly is the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission released quite a bit of data about taxi cab activity. They released a database containing 173 million rides, and that data included the times of the rides, the geographic coordinates, fares, and tips for when the customer paid in a form of payment other than cash. And so the cabs have a unique number, or I think it's called a medallion. What happened was paparazzi, not surprisingly, was taking pictures of famous individuals, and those pictures included the medallion numbers. And as a result, some very bright analysts, in most cases these were young college students or recently graduated college students, were able to take these values, determine the hash output based on a common hash. I believe they used the MD5 hashing algorithm, and were able to re-identify these individuals. So they were able to determine, where, these pictures, where Bradley Cooper was picked up, where he went to, how long his ride took, what he paid. I think in Bradley Cooper's case, he paid in cash. They couldn't determine what his tip was, but it just demonstrates what you need to be careful of when you're managing these unique IDs. Thank goodness for the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission. This wasn't protected health information, but it was at the very least embarrassing. And so this demonstrates some issues to be aware of when you're hashing and when you're handling unique IDs. So My corny joke here is to make sure you use salt. So use lots of salt. So another technical consideration is when you're de-identifying text or unstructured data. It's riskier and more time-consuming. Often can be a manual process and very labor-intensive. So that your cost needs to be considered there. Oftentimes, people make the decision just to remove the text or unstructured data altogether because the quality of the output is questionable. When there's quality questions, you can have a higher risk of re-identification. So I would recommend being suspicious of automated processes, though there are several out there that work very well. Another way to arrive at structured data from unstructured data is to use something called natural language processing, or NLP. There's quite a bit of industry literature out there on how to use that kind of methodology, that tool. And for these reasons, because of the risk here, it's often businesses will just decide not to de-identify text or unstructured data. In the vein of technical considerations, there's quite a bit of software out there, and some of these are very good. Some of these can be require a lot of customization and tuning. And these products seem to be growing in the marketplace as time continues. And you have to be careful to make sure that these products, if they do claim to de-identify data under HIPAA, that's very obvious. Some might not make that statement and will say they de-identify data, which can be useful, but requires the implementation in accordance with HIPAA. And then I think it shouldn't be overlooked that these products and these vendors don't remove you as a healthcare entity the obligation of making sure you have the right to de-identify, and we touched on that. I just want to amplify it again here. And then, so this list is just some of the software vendors out there. There's also I think you also have the option, especially in the expert method, to use some consultants out there. There's a number of them that might be also a very good option, and in some ways might provide a better result as far as in particular with the expert method. So privacy considerations. It shouldn't be lost on us that the de-identified data is confidential unless you consciously make the decision to publicize the data, and that is something that I would underline and be very careful about doing. You have to consider who you're disclosing the data to, especially, and as required under the expert method, you have to consider who the recipient is. You need to consider what resides in that de-identified data. Example might be if you're de-identifying healthcare claims, there can be payment activity, there can be information in some cases about a tax identification number, which of course could be a social security number in certain situations. It's common in the healthcare setting for providers to use their SSN as their tax identification number. And so take a careful look at what comes out of the de-identification process. Don't jump to the conclusion that it's de-identified, therefore you can disclose it to anybody and there's no risk. That's quite the opposite is quite true. And then underline again, if you're releasing the data publicly, take extra care, either with the expert method, and there have been a number of examples of where the expert method has worked quite well in disclosing publicly, or if you're using the safe harbor method. I would also recommend you be careful there. And so ways to mitigate risk. There's data use agreements are a strong way of using administrative controls to address and mitigate your risk of disclosing your de-identified data to other parties. I think that's something you see commonly used with data that's de-identified under the expert or the safe harbor method, and it usually provides a number of additional controls and protections when you're doing that. The second point here is to use security controls. Even though the data is de-identified, of course we have those numerous confidential and sensitive data elements that remain within it, and often the de-identified data is very valuable to the company, the entity who's de-identified it, so they want to protect it and use it ethically. So, and then another reason to use security controls, it can also help support if you're using expert, they're very low risk of re-identification. Some of their statistical analysis might assume that you've got, might be built into that analysis, that you've got strong security controls. So remember that security is always a good place security controls are always good to have over de-identified data, because the data that's de-identified does not have zero risk of being re-identified. It always has some risk, and in the case of the expert method, that risk should be at least very small. So the takeaway here is I would think it's important to consider treating de-identified data like PHI. So recent activity in the industry, in March 2015, High Trust, and for full disclosure, I was on the committee that worked on this, but they released some standards on de-identification. These went to a lot of depth. They considered, they provided some definitions on levels of anonymization or de-identified data. It touched on kind of the longitudinal and different risks with that data. It went to the criteria for evaluating de-identification methodologies, estimating the risk of re-identification, provided a lot more detail on what type of expertise should be looked at in these methodologies. And then it also created a control framework for what should be considered for managing the risk of the the de-identified data. So something to look at. And then there's also been some recent news on the re-identification aspect. There's less recently. There's been a number of articles published about re-identification risk with Netflix, State of Washington, and those, I don't want to downplay those, but they're not. I wouldn't classify them as recent. The one that's more recent was about the credit card data, and this it's funny, you can't. There was no origin of this data published, so I think some of the content was raised eyebrows because it didn't provide a lot of detail for it to be looked at broadly. So we don't know where the credit card data originated from, and it was difficult to understand. In reading the article, and I'm just kind of commenting from what we saw out there, was that the data might not have been re-identified, but they use the term liberally here to talk about the uniqueness they were able to get to based on their analysis. And so it's interesting, it might be worth looking at. You might walk away a little confused, like I was after the first read. And then it's also interesting to see that the NIST is working on an internal report, and if it didn't make it clear, this is a draft report, so they are still working on this, but have, I think, collected commentary from the industry, and it will be interesting to see what their internal report looks like and how much it touches on the HIPAA aspects of de-identification. But with the quality that comes out of NIST, it should be anxiously anticipated. So I've covered a lot of material. I hope I've given you things to consider, and I hope you found this information useful. If I didn't make it clear, OCR has excellent guidance out there. I think it came out in late 2012, and I would recommend you go out to their website and look at that. De-identification, I think it can be done safely. It requires the review and expertise that security and privacy members bring to it. You should consider what you're de-identifying, how you're de-identifying, safe harbor, the expert method. Do you have an expert? Is the risk very small? Is that process documented? And who's accessing the de-identified data? What's left in that data? Are those values sensitive still? Are they confidential? Are they competitive? Look at all those things, and I hope you're able to expand your knowledge some from here, or it just gives you helps you. Maybe you've already got all these boxes checked, which is even better. So I think that takes us through the discussion. So I will open it up to questions here.
So Peter, we've had a couple of questions come in. One of them that I'll throw out to you is they asked about the use of documenting how you went through your de-identification methodology. Does that need to be spelled out anywhere? Does there need to be a policy on it? Or is there any kind of time limit that you need to worry about keeping that kind of information around?
So I think I heard a couple questions in there, but from a policy standpoint, yeah, I think it's a good practice to have a policy on de-identification. It might be as simple as kind of making sure you've got a policy from an internal standpoint. Some entities might consider it too risky to use the expert method and just want to rely on the safe harbor method. If that's what you want to do, then I would make that clear within your business. And then as far as retaining I want to make sure I understand this. Retaining is it the documentation for the expert method?
I think they were talking about, do you need to retain any type of documentation that showed how you actually went through the de-identification methodology, okay, be it expert or safe harbor?
Yeah, I would recommend you that information, or I've seen that information be retained through the life of the data, and so that can vary greatly if you're using safe harbor or expert method, and then it might be a good practice to retain that in accordance with HIPAA. So you could take a very conservative position, which would be the safe way to go here, is to keep it for the HIPAA requirements for PHI, which are 7 years, 6 years, depending on how you kind of orient yourself to that.
Yeah. So another question that has come in, how often should you re-review statistically de-identified data for risk?
That's a good question. It varies. I think if you're using the expert method, they should, depending on your expert, they would probably give you that time period, and that might be what that may be part of your analysis, is that the data could be de-identified for 6 months, a year. Commonly, I think you see like a year is a pretty safe benchmark for the expert method. In safe harbor, even has might have some risk with it as well, just based on the nature of data proliferation. I think you're seeing some privacy experts cast doubt on some of the more liberal interpretations of the safe harbor method. So it's up to you, but I think a common benchmark is a year for expert, and then safe harbor would it should just kind of go into how you're de-identifying under safe harbor. What is the output of that?
Okay, our next question that came in, so what is the risk of using the 5-digit zip code in de-identified data?
That's a good one. And so, I think safe harbor intentionally, kept things at a pretty high geography at, state, and even zip 3 is they kind of imply that it's more risky. So at a real high level, you've got you've got a couple hundred zip codes at the 3-digit level, I think just under 900, and then you've got about 43,000 zip 5s, and that's if you're using the postal definition, it's a pretty fluid landscape. Those values were meant for delivering mail, not for de-identifying data. To kind of try to cast some humor into this, but I would be very careful. You've seen, I think, Dr. LaTanya Sweeney show in considerable depth how risky that can be. So if you're not using an expert and you've got other information about an individual zip 5, I would be very careful. Commonly you'll see that you've got some very small populations in zip 5s, and those would need to be carefully considered.
All right. Final question that we've got, and I'll just remind anyone, if you've got any further questions, please utilize your GoToWebinar control panel. There's the ability there to type questions in so we can relay those back to Peter. Does the minimum necessary rule apply to de-identified information?
So it's an interesting analysis there. I would say it doesn't, well, might not, because of the data is not PHI. But then, the other thing you should look at is it's a tenant that you find throughout privacy and security. So it just kind of runs. They have to question, if you've got more data than you need, is that really a safe thing? So it's a question you need to kind of look closely at. I wouldn't go so far as to give you a yes or no answer, but there may be the way of not answering it. I'm not trying to be evasive. Is that it's the de-identified data doesn't fall within HIPAA. It's not PHI, so you're probably safer. But I think it's always something you should look at. What is the minimum necessary? What is safe? What is needed to do someone's work? Would that be a researcher? And I think a researcher would argue, well, I commonly need all the data because I'm trying to perform some very valuable research. But if you're looking at it in a different light, if you're doing some analytics, or you're providing a report to a customer, then yeah, minimum necessary is probably something you should more closely look at.
Okay. The next question it's actually a couple of questions here. Does HIPAA apply only to medical claims? What about disability claims and claims from specified disease states like critical illness and policies?
Good question. Well, yeah, and I probably should have gone into more detail on that in the start of the call. But yeah, HIPAA of course applies to all protected health information, and that is, I won't go into the verbatim definition, but it's data that's created or received by a covered entity or a health plan provider, and relates to an individual, relates to past, present care, and so I think that's the way you should look at this.
Okay. Any other questions coming in?
Very good questions. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything, Peter.
All right.
All right. I'd just like to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded, and a copy of the recording and the slide deck will be sent out to everyone who registered on Monday. So you'll be able to share that with any colleagues that missed the presentation today. I just want to thank everyone for participating, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mark. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.